Hello, everybody, and welcome to Lecture 1, Introduction to Philosophy. I'm Dr. Brad Mussel, and this is the course Logic and Critical Thinking, Philosophy 121, Johnson County Community College. And so before we turn our attention to our specific subject matter, logic and critical thinking, and differentiating what we mean by logic versus critical thinking, amongst many other things, um, you know, one of the things we'll learn very quickly here is that logic is a branch of philosophy, right? You study logic through the philosophy department. Aristotle, a famous philosopher, who we'll talk more about here in a moment, introduced a lot of what we're going to talk about in our logic class, 2,000 plus years ago. And so, since logic and critical thinking more generally, right, is typically associated with philosophy, well, I thought it would be of interest then to start there, right? And to start more generally then and flesh out what exactly philosophy is. We won't spend a lot of time, but we'll talk a little bit about what philosophy is in general. And then, with the next lecture, we'll go ahead and dive into our specific um, subject matter, which, as we'll see at the end of this lecture, happens to be one of the primary branches then of philosophy in general. Our specific subject, logic and critical thinking. We'll turn our attention to that then in the second lecture. So the game plan here for the first lecture, again, just to kind of give you a little sense of what philosophy is in general, is to kind of carve out, what it is in a general sense. And of course, one of the first things I'll mention is that you probably have a rough kind of formulation of it coming into this course or whatever course. We have an everyday sense of philosophy, and that's probably kind of on par with really what it amounts to. But we'll talk more about what exactly philosophy is in general. But then we'll turn our attention to a historical breakdown of philosophy. I'm going to discuss the various eras of the history of philosophy, talk about some of the more notable figures, talk about some of the main points of emphasis in each of these eras. And then we'll go ahead and turn our attention to a much shorter than categorical breakdown of philosophy in general, which, as I alluded to, one of the then branches, as we'll see, is going to be our particular subject, logic, or more generally, critical thinking. One of the things I want to mention, so I've got to mention things while they're on my mind, otherwise I'll forget them. Is I'm going to, as I go through this stuff, be mentioning that what slide I'm on, what slide I'm turning to, so that you can kind of follow along. Again, the idea is that you will print off the PowerPoint slides beforehand and then follow along as you watch this video. Another thing I wanted to mention before we dive in, while I'm thinking about it in terms of this stuff, is that look, nothing is set in stone about this historical breakdown that I'm going to offer you, or the categorical breakdown that I'm going to offer you. Depending on what philosopher or what philosophy textbook, or which philosopher you're talking to, you might get a different sort of picture of what the history of philosophy looks like, or you might get a slightly different breakdown of the main categories of philosophy. Now, what I will say, and so I just wanted to say that at the outset, and for our purposes, what do you guys need to worry about? Again, we're starting very general. You don't need to worry about what particular thinkers fell into what particular eras, or what particular dates a particular era began and ended with. You just want to know the more general stuff, that there were these four eras and so on, and kind of their general order. Okay. But I wanted to concede at the outset that look, there's nothing set in stone about this in terms of a particular date where one particular era ends and the next one begins and so on. But what I will say is that most textbooks that I'm familiar with, most philosophers that I'm familiar with, they're going to reference there being these four general eras of philosophy. You will hear the modern era referenced in philosophical discussions. Okay, so while there might be some debate about where the particular era ends and another one begins, and hence you can see these approximation symbols here, right? Approximately here. This is where I'm going to suggest that the medieval era ends and the modern era begins. And so while there's some debate there, or that can vary, it's still generally known or suggested that there are these four eras. And I think it's still of interest to us, regardless if there is some difference in opinion in terms of where these particular eras begin and end. That there are these eras. We'll talk more about why there are eras in the first place. But again, as students of a philosophy class, it would be of interest to us to know a little bit of something about the history of philosophy. So that's the point, here. And so too, yes, there are different sort of categorizations of philosophy on offer depending on which textbook you come across. But in general, there are, in tradition, I call this the traditional or classical breakdown of philosophy, because I would say up until like 20 years ago, this was pretty much the standard. You didn't really encounter any different kind of breakdown. But, starting about 20 years ago, I'd say you started to see more and more textbooks where they would add a category or two. For example, philosophy of religion might be thrown in there, or political philosophy, whereas those were previously subsumed in these other categories. Some philosophers started to distinguish them as their own particular branches. But again, be that as it may, uh, it's still going to be of interest for us to, as best we can, sort of talk about what the general areas of philosophy are. So again, that's the general game plan here. But I wanted to mention at the outset again that there is nothing necessarily set in stone about the particular dates or the particular categories. So let's go ahead then and turn to slide 2 again. So we're here to study logic and critical thinking more generally. It's a philosophy class. So what is philosophy? And so I mentioned earlier that we probably all have a kind of general sense of what philosophy is coming into the course, and I would say that's probably pretty accurate. We think of the philosopher typically as one who thinks about the deep stuff, and that's certainly true. That's what got me into the subject myself. I'm the kind of person that I lie awake at night thinking about this stuff. So obviously the deep stuff is of interest to us, but it's also everyday sort of stuff too. Philosophers are just interested in the truth, and I think that is an important point to make here. It's not just always the deep, big questions. Philosophers, by definition, what is philosophy? It's a Greek term that has two Greek root words, philos and sophia, which mean lover or friend of wisdom or knowledge, right? So you're after wisdom or knowledge or the truth, okay? Whether that's capital T truth or everyday average, little t truths, right? I mean, think about logic and critical thinking, our particular subject. This is something that, as we'll see more and more as we progress through the course, is something that you can apply to almost presumably every facet of your life, okay? So, and it is in some sense, and I think I'm going to try to flesh this out as we proceed, but it's kind of the method of philosophy in general, logic and critical thinking is. And so, again, very much applicable to not just the deep questions, but insofar as you're concerned with good reasoning and knowing the truth at all, right? That's what philosophy is about. And then logic and critical thinking, right? It's sort of method, right? That's the application of that. That's the process of applying, you know, um, or pursuing that fundamental interest in the truth. And again, that's something that not only does it deal with is there life after death and does God exist and the big questions, right? But it is something that, and we'll flesh this out in much more detail in the next lecture as well. But it's something that literally applies to seemingly every facet of our lives. So I think that, again, that's an important point. We all have a general kind of colloquial sense of what philosophy amounts to, and that's fair, right? But philosophy is, it also encapsulates much more than that general sense, or connotation that we typically have, right? It is concerned with just the truth, okay, in general. Okay, so let's go ahead and turn to slide 3, where then we'll kind of turn our attention to this historical breakdown of philosophy that I'm going to offer here. So real quick, why these eras to begin with? Why do philosophers distinguish there being any eras to begin with? Why this particular era as opposed to this, why distinguish what happened here versus what happened here and so on. And that's because, well, one of the things I'll mention is that none of the categories or elements of philosophy are ever neglected at any point. in the history of philosophy, there are certain elements of philosophy that become of more interest to philosophers at the time. So there are more points of emphasis. The points of emphasis, or what's of most interest to the philosophers at the time, that does change, as we'll see. And so that is then the impetus for, in hindsight, philosophers looking back on the history of philosophy, suggesting that there's kind of these distinct eras, because there's kind of these themes that emerge, if you will, in terms of what mattered most to the philosophers at those particular time periods. So, but I do think it's worth mentioning again, just underscoring that point that while something in particular is really going to emerge as being of particular interest in the medieval era, again, they were still doing logic, they were still doing, all elements of philosophy, even though certain elements were of particular interest. Right? So that's why we have this notion of there being eras in the first place. Okay? And so what are the four eras? They're the ancient, the medieval, the modern, and the contemporary. And so I thought, what I would do then is just go ahead and turn our attention to each one and talk a little bit about it in turn, beginning with, the beginning, the ancient era, where it all begins, roughly the 6th century BC. And again, while I'm thinking about it, the first thing I want to mention is that there are a whole slew of incredibly important, very well-known thinkers in this particular time period, right? The Buddha, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. And in fact, one of the things that kind of sticks out in my mind about this particular era is how well known these ancient thinkers are. They're the oldest, and yet if you were to go poll the average Joe Blow walking down the street and say, "Have you heard of a philosopher?" Odds are if they have heard of a philosopher, it's one of these ancient thinkers. And that's always been kind of interesting to me. That they're the oldest and yet they're the most well known, and that's for good reason, because they make significant impacts on philosophy. A lot of these guys, Plato, Aristotle, their work still shines through in what's going on today. In fact, who was it? Alfred North Whitehead, who once said all of philosophy is but a footnote to Plato, or something to that effect, suggesting that nothing new has happened since Plato, right? He pretty much covered the gamut in terms of the things that are of interest to philosophers, and then everybody kind of reacts to what Plato said in one shape or form. Aristotle, look at Aristotle. He's one for whom that his significance in philosophy is going to shine through in our course. Aristotle and his ties to logic are pretty well known, and still a lot of what our curriculum offers in terms of this logic and critical thinking class still stems almost verbatim from what Aristotle introduced 2,000 plus years ago. So if you take nothing away from the ancient era, just know that it was a significant period where a lot of really notable, influential philosophy took place. And again, there's a reason why not just philosophers know of these guys. And so one thing I would throw up here, the Buddha obviously is a pretty famous ancient philosopher, but I always like to be as helpful as possible. And so one helpful acronym for the ancient thinkers that are particularly well known, the Athenians, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And so that acronym SPA will hopefully help you remember. And what's interesting about this order is that's actually the order that they came to us, in. Right? Socrates came first, and he was Plato's mentor, and then Aristotle was Plato's student, actually was in Plato's academy for like 20 years or so, and only finally left to form his own school in philosophy known as the Lyceum after Plato dies. When Aristotle was 38 or something like that. He was pretty old himself at that point. But anyway, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, big figures in the ancient era. So we talked about when it began, roughly speaking. When does it end? We'll just say roughly the fall of the Roman Empire. So 476, again, there's nothing set in stone about this, but that's just a good point, at least in my mind, to kind of demarcate when the ancient era ended and the medieval era then begins. But real quick, what stood out other than there being hugely or, very significant thinkers doing their thing, so to speak, during this time period? Well, what else stood out? Well, the interesting thing is that nothing stood out. Unlike these other eras where you do have particular branches of philosophy that seem of particular interest to the thinkers at the time, the ancient era stands out in that that's not actually the case. They seemed seemingly interested in every facet of philosophy. Aristotle is another great example here because he wrote books on seemingly everything under the sun, physics, metaphysics, poetics, politics. He literally had books on all these, Nicomachean ethics, botany, the study of plants. And we only have like 1/5 of his original writings that supposedly have survived, and we have all of these works. So again, what kind of stands out about the ancient era is that nothing stands out, right? They're seemingly interested in all facets of philosophy. So I mentioned, the big three, the Buddha. You also have the pre-Socratics, guys like Pythagoras, Parmenides, Heraclitus. So Parmenides, the guy that said all is one, and then Heraclitus was kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum. He said all is in flux. The idea you can't step into the same river twice because it's always changing and hence never the same. Right? The water will always be somewhere else, and so on. So, pretty famous thinkers in their own right, who again had profound influences. Who maybe the average Joe Blow hasn't heard of necessarily Parmenides or Heraclitus, but their influence runs deep, and they maybe the average Joe Blow has heard of Nietzsche, who was influenced by these guys, or something along those lines, or John Locke, or so on and so forth. Um, anyway, so that's the ancient era. We'll go ahead then and transition to the medieval era then. So we'll again suggest that it begins roughly with the fall of the Roman Empire, 476. Okay, so what stands out about the medieval era? Interest in philosophy of religion, interest in God, and not necessarily most of these philosophers or thinkers, they didn't question God's existence for quite some time, really. It was pretty much assumed. I mean, they did, there were debates about which proof of God's existence was best and so on, but most of the debate, or a lot of the debate, was more along the lines of God's essence. What is God like? They just assumed, or it was assumed that everyone took that for granted, right? God exists, but what is God like? Okay, so a lot of the discussion was about that. Well, God couldn't be like this because of so on and so forth, right? So a lot of the philosophical debate and discussion, one way or another, was about God and elements or issues in the philosophy of religion. But don't forget that they didn't neglect any aspect of philosophy at any point, right? So they're still doing all elements of philosophy, but again, philosophy of religion, discussions of God become pretty important in philosophical circles during this time period. And so we go all the way up to the early Renaissance period. We'll say 1400 just for the sake of a nice easy date. Okay, that's the end then of the medieval era. One theme that I thought, other than pointing out obviously philosophy of religion and discussions of God being of interest to the medieval thinkers, another thing I think that's worth highlighting is that there a theme that kind of emerged. It seemed to be this interest in not necessarily even interest, but respect for the ancient thinkers on the part of the medieval philosophers. So, for example, a lot of times they would marry their own particular theology then with the ancient thinkers that they were particularly interested in. So, for example, Augustine famously is a Platonic. You know, he followed Plato and married his own particular theology within Plato's philosophy. And so too Aquinas. So many of you might have heard of St. Thomas Aquinas, was known as being an Aristotelian. And if you've read both, I mean, you can see their similarity in their methodology and kind of how they proceed, and how they speak, and the concepts they use a lot of the times are very similar. And so you can see Aristotle's then influence on Aquinas. But so you get that appreciation on the part of the medieval thinkers oftentimes, at least I've noticed, for the ancient thinkers who preceded them. Wanted to mention another, let's put it down here, another easy acronym that's always helped me for the medieval thinkers that are the most notable, at least in my mind. St. Anselm, they're all saints. So Anselm is probably not one that's as well known as the other two, unless you've taken a philosophy course. He's pretty well known for a proof, so to speak, for the existence of God, known as the ontological argument. But otherwise, outside of philosophy classes, and specifically philosophy of religion, usually most people haven't heard of him, but Augustine, a lot of us have heard of Augustine, and then Aquinas. So yeah, triple A there. I think that's pretty much all I wanted to say about the medieval era. So roughly the early Renaissance period, then we'll transition to slide 6 here. Turn it, into the, let's say, the 1400s, early Renaissance period. You got to be careful kind of how I say this. You could just shift. It's not, I don't want to say that it's like science versus religion, because that's not the case at all. Again, most of these thinkers for a long, long time, right, they're just, they questioning God's existence wasn't even a thing really for a lot of these thinkers. But you did get a newfound appreciation, it seemed like, for objective kinds of knowledge, things we can replicate, right? That's, rooted in this concrete, tangible realm, right? Empirical world that we can see, touch, feel, etc. Right? And so, correspondingly, then, in terms of philosophy, you get an emphasis from the modern era on epistemology and metaphysics, which we'll flesh out in more detail here in a moment when we go through our categorical breakdown of philosophy. But it basically deals with questions regarding our knowledge. What is knowledge in the first place? But then, what are the kinds of things we know? And then what exists to be known? What is real? That's what metaphysics is all about. And so those two, M&E for short, metaphysics and epistemology, they really come to the forefront in the modern era. Okay. Another thing we should point out right away, right, is that you will oftentimes, and so this is actually a very important point here, the modern era of philosophy being referenced. And so if you're going to become obviously very intrigued and interested in philosophy. And when you hear of, Joe Blow, the amazing modern philosopher, don't go Googling then trying to find his next lecture. If it's a modern philosopher, he's been dead for well over 100 years. Okay, so modern in these philosophical discussions, right? That when you hear the modern era reference, that is not now. Okay? Instead, that'll be the contemporary era, right? Modern refers to this 500-year period, 1400s to the 1900s. Right? So keep that in mind. I mentioned that on the top of slide 6. Who does their thing during the modern era? Oh my goodness, this was such a rich period of philosophy. You've probably heard of so many. We mentioned Friedrich Nietzsche before, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke I mentioned before, David Hume, Rene Descartes, Immanuel Kant. You can go on and on and on. John Stuart Mill, especially if you include, again, where we end the modern era. So some might be inclined to end it a little shorter. But if you include, up till the 1900s, you're including like William James, John Stuart Mill, a lot of, Nietzsche. There's just so many, again, philosophers that would fall into the modern, era. Soren Kierkegaard, Albert Camus, and these guys are all making huge contributions, not only in metaphysics and epistemology, but in various aspects of philosophy as well, including ethics and logic. So modern era, arguably, ancient is right up there, but a very rich time period in philosophy that's been arguably unparalleled, other than maybe the ancient era. Okay, by the ancient era. Okay. Transitioning into slide 7, we'll go ahead and move on to the contemporary era. So it's basically synonymous, as I mentioned on the top of slide 7, with the 20th and 21st century philosophy that's going on, in these centuries. So y'all are contemporary philosophers as well, because you are interested in and doing philosophy now, right? So you're a contemporary philosopher. Why the new era, this new era that emerged, again, for our purposes, we'll say it 1900. We'll try to keep it nice and simple. Okay. So why this new era? Well, it's a pretty interesting story, actually. up at, preceding 1900, up to the turn of the century here, you had a feud that emerged in philosophy, and it becomes more and more intense, and then it finally just kind of boils over and erupts right around the turn of the century. And so that's then the rationale for the suggesting then that there's this new era, because we get right around the turn of the century then there's two distinct camps that emerge. Continental. I don't think that's right, but maybe it is. So again, this feud was kind of simmering, and then it just boils over, and this schism within philosophy has been present ever since, and really it's inescapable. And then when you discover that, hey, you're really into this method of philosophy, this logic and critical thinking stuff, I want to go pursue philosophy, and then you're interested in signing up for graduate school in philosophy. Well, this is going to still affect you then here, in 2020. Is that our year 2020? This is still having a profound effect, because there's a geographical correlation then that correlates to or corresponds to this gulf in terms of these two camps, that will affect, if you want to go into grad school in philosophy, arguably will affect then where you're going to be living to be able to pursue philosophy. Okay, more on that here in a moment. So what are these two camps? What is this feud all about? So let's start first with the analytic camp, the analytic tradition. So you had some philosophers who were of the opinion, and actually they're very much into logic, into our subject. We're of the opinion that when it comes to philosophy, right, and a lot of this, it really boils down to, um, in addition to, as I'm going to suggest, whether or not there are substantial philosophical problems, kind of a debate about the proper methodology of philosophy. So this people of this analytic camp, they were of the mindset that, hey, really, if you reflect on it, all these so-called philosophical problems, there aren't really any substantial philosophical problems. In fact, if you adequately reflect on things, what you'll realize is that all these so-called problems are really just a reflection of our crappy thinking and speaking. And if we can just perfect then, so analytic camp, if we can just perfect the way we think and speak, hence our logic and language, then we'll see all these so-called problems in philosophy disappear, and we'll realize that we are really the ones creating these so-called problems through our muddied way of thinking and speaking. And what we really need to do is be clearer and more critical thinkers and speakers. So what are the emphases here? Logic and language. They love, right? Analytic philosophers, they love the sort of thing we are going to be emphasizing in our own course, right? Logic, critical thinking, and they root sort of most problems in philosophy, they would suggest, boil down to issues in logic and perhaps relatedly then language. Okay. Conversely, though, you had the Continental camp, people who were of the mindset that, look, I don't care how good we get at thinking, and I don't care how good we get at speaking, you're never going to be able to tell me why there's something and not nothing. Right? There are legitimate, significant philosophical problems that no degree of improvement in our thinking and speaking is going to render clear, right? No. You have, again, substantial, significant problems, and emphasizing these, while maybe beneficial, that's not really what needs to be done in philosophy, right? That shouldn't be what we're emphasizing. And you get, various schools of thought associated with the Continental camp then. One famous one that you might be familiar with is the existentialism, which we won't get into here, but just wanted to point out that is a school or tradition associated with the Continental camp in philosophy. And so not only is there this sort of gulf that emerges, but this is significant, and there's a lot of animosity here. analytics say of the Continentals, their heads are in the clouds. You can never sort of relate to what they're talking about. They're too ambiguous and mystical in the way they speak, hence their need for greater clarity with their thinking and speaking, right? So you can never really wrestle down or pin down what it is they're trying to say. You know, the analytics say of the Continentals. And then conversely, the Continentals will say of the analytics. They're cold, robotic, logic chopping machines who have no appreciation for the true human condition and the fact that we do face significant existential problems, as we proceed throughout our life, that there are significant philosophical problems. And so you get, again, a lot of this back and forth. And for what it's worth, I've always hated this gulf, this distinction, this difference, but it is what it is. And again, it affects, again, it's affected my life, and I'll give you a personal story here in a moment, but you go into philosophy, it's going to affect, your career. And for what it's worth, again, I hate the gulf. I've known plenty of Continental thinkers and writers who were much clearer than some analytic, writers and thinkers. And so I don't like their, the analytic criticism of the Continentals. And so too, I've known several analytic thinkers who were not cold, hearted logic chopping machines that had some appreciation for, the true, significant problems that we all face and as human beings, you know, living a life here on Earth. So I'm not a big fan of it, but it is what it is, and it's certainly still palpable again to this day. And so I mentioned there's geographical correlation too. So what I mean by that is, so when you decide you are interested in philosophy, well, you're going to have to pick a side, so to speak, just like you seem to have to pick a side if you want to play the political game in our country. You got to pick a side here, pick a team, because if you are interested in analytic philosophy, well, then you're going to stay in the United States, maybe go to Great Britain, right? But what if you are interested more in the continental camp, right? You've heard of this existentialism stuff. You've read Sartre or Derrida or whoever else, Camus or whoever else you've associated with existentialism. You want to study continental. Well, good luck, right? If you're in the United States, because the hotbed of the continental tradition is in Europe, particularly Germany and France, right? So again, totally different places you will have to go to study. Now, there are exceptions. So let's say there are 300 roughly academic programs in philosophy here in the United States. I would say at most, maybe, again, it's been a while since I've looked into this, so don't quote me on this, but let's say there are, most 10% are associated with continental camp. The other 90% of the departments in the United States are going to be associated with analytic, right? So out of 300, only say 30 of them would be considered continental, right? And so it just so happens to be the case that, I mentioned in the course introduction video that I have a master's degree from, Boston College. Well, that is one of those few that are associated with continental tradition. Okay? And then fast forward, as I mentioned, I have a PhD from the University of Kansas. That is as analytic as it gets, at least in my experience. So, and I can tell you firsthand, the approach, how they teach, the teachers, the instructors at these different institutions, their approach is completely different. And when I enrolled, at Boston College, they didn't really, I mean, if I recall correctly, they didn't ask, what my experience in logic was at all. Fast forward to enrolling in the PhD program at KU, they admitted me, but it was only, contingent on me agreeing to take another extra or higher level logic class, in addition to the ones I'd already taken. So not only were they interested in whether I had some logic experience, but it had to be, sufficient, and it had to be a certain number. So their emphasis on logic, for example, totally different than their teaching style. And their writing, it does tend to be, how the philosophers, whether or not they associate with whichever camp, right? There do seem to be some differences then in sort of their teaching style and kind of how their writing comes across. And again, it is palpable, it is appreciable. And I mentioned a sort of personal story too. So obviously, I got this firsthand. I spent, what was it, 2 years so to get my master's degree at Boston College, and then, way longer than it should have been at Kansas before I got my PhD. But so enough time in both to have a fair experience, I think, in dealing with both camps. I still have a vivid memory when I first came to Lawrence, you know, I think it was even the first week when I was studying at the University of Kansas, and a fellow grad student, and was looking at this book and I was saying, you know, have you read this? And he said, isn't that Continental? And I said, yeah. And he said, I don't read that crap. He just dismissed it, you know, right away without looking into it any further. And that's how deep the animosity runs for a lot of, in my opinion, unfortunately, right, for a lot of philosophers, that they really do have an allegiance, if you will, to a particular sort of viewpoint regarding what philosophy is, and you know how we should go about doing philosophy. Um, for better or worse, in my opinion, for worse. I'm not a big fan, like I said, of the division, but it is there, as I've tried to point out. I think I mentioned all these points. I mentioned, you know, who are some of the big figures. Sartre, Ludwig Wittgenstein, Bertrand Russell. He's a big figure known with associated with the analytic tradition. So that's the contemporary era. Again, the big thing that stands out is this huge division that emerges in philosophical circles. Turning to slide 8, then we will turn to a much shorter discussion then of the categories of philosophy. So I'll just preface this discussion by reiterating once more that this isn't the breakdown, right? There are other ways of breaking philosophy down, but it'll be the way we break it down for this course. Okay. So, you know, real quick, and I intimated earlier, you know, what each of these are. I guess we didn't really mention too much about ethics, but I talked a little bit about these two, and then obviously mentioned a little bit about what this is, and we'll flesh that out in much more detail, really for the rest of the course, obviously. But let's go ahead and turn our attention, though, to each of these and say a little bit about what they are in a little bit more detail. So epistemology is anything knowledge related in philosophy, right? So, you know, you could say, oh my goodness, you could say, you know, the whole question of what knowledge is to begin with. Okay? That has been an issue debated notoriously for, you know, as far back as philosophy goes, back to the ancient era. What does it even mean to know something? Okay? You have to flesh that out before you can then turn your attention to what it is you know. Okay? So, for example, do we want to require certainty? Okay, for you to be able to say that you know something, and we'll get into this, you know, ideas of what it means to know something actually in the next lecture as well. But do you want to require this notion of certainty? To me, and I've talked about this in my other videos and other lectures and so on. To me, it's always made more sense to require certainty when you say you know something. If you weren't certain of it, in what sense did you know it? Okay, but as philosophers have pointed out, notoriously like David Hume, who's known for his skepticism, if that's, you know, that's the kind of idea of knowledge he was working with, and with that requirement of certainty, Hume, you know, is famous for skepticism, suggesting how little then we in fact know. Okay, can we in fact know really anything with certainty? Hume gives us all kinds of reasons to question things that we take for granted as if they obviously exist, like for example causality and so forth, cause and effect. We won't get into that, but just wanted to give you kind of a taste of, you know, what sorts of issues are at play here, okay, for someone who's doing or interested in epistemology. Okay, it's knowledge-related questions or issues. And then very much connected is metaphysics, or what exists, what's real. And I say very much connected because, you know, these are very much intertwined. So they're different things that are being emphasized, but, you know, how can you say something about what we know without saying something, or at least implying something about what exists, okay, to be known, right? And conversely, how can you talk about, you know, what exists without suggesting something about, you know, what it is we know? You're speaking to what exists. Well, you must know it to be the case, right? To say it exists. Okay. So these are very much intertwined, but again, what we're emphasizing when we're doing, you know, epistemology versus metaphysics is different. Okay, nonetheless. So Metaphysics, we're all familiar with like the Matrix and brain in a vat type thought experiments. Or am I dreaming? We've all had very intense dreams, which we thought were real at the time, right? But then lo and behold, no, it wasn't real at all. We wake up to reality, right? So these are kinds of questioning, this kind of questioning can get us, our minds racing. What is real? And so those sorts of questions belong to metaphysics. Then, another related issue, what is thought? That's an aspect of philosophy of mind, which is metaphysics. When we have a thought, is that merely neurons firing in a certain way, as the physicalist or materialist might suggest? Right? And they just, everything can be explained, thoughts included, or anything we typically associate with our mental capacity. That can be explained as merely physiological processes, or is thought indicative of a distinct, separate sort of existence? Call it spiritual or mental. As the dualist might suggest, somebody who suggests there's two types of existence. Right? That's an issue. That sort of discussion. That's metaphysics. Okay, and then we have ethics, and you can take a whole course on Intro to Ethics, which we offer at Johnson County Community College. I offer it usually every semester myself. What's good, what's evil, what's right, what's wrong? How do we know those sorts of things? So we all go about in our everyday lives, no doubt, tossing these terms around. A lot of us probably pretty liberally, right? We use them with ease. How often do we actually reflect on those sorts of things? What gives me the license to say that Sally was so wrong for doing Y or whatever she did? Right? How do I know that? And ethics, or moral philosophy, or however you want to refer to this branch of philosophy, that's all about getting to the root of morality, of figuring out what is the foundation of morality, offering us a theory, a framework with which to work and to flesh out how it is in fact we know that Sally was wrong when she did Y. What gives us the justification for saying she's wrong? Right? That's what ethics at least attempts to do. Of course, not all moral philosophers will suggest there is any such thing as right and wrong, right? They're moral skeptics, but again, that's ethics. That would be part of moral philosophy, studying that, right? Is there any such thing as ethics to begin with? Okay. And then finally, why we're here, right? Logic. And when we talk about it being a category of philosophy, when we refer to logic, we really mean more generally critical thinking as well. Okay. So critical thinking and logic. It's the branch of philosophy concerned with proper reasoning and what good arguments are and identifying and assessing them. And, I've really thought about this more and more lately, how really this branch of philosophy is focusing on the method of philosophy itself, right? And then this gets applied by philosophers and all these other aspects of philosophy then, right? As a method, right? If they're doing things right, okay, well then they're taking all these things we're going to talk about all throughout this course, and they're applying them to one another and what they're saying and their arguments and so on, to try to better establish who's closer to the truth regarding what really exists or what we can know. Right? So, and I'll try to flesh that out as we proceed, kind of the relationship between logic and critical thinking itself, this branch of philosophy, and then philosophy in general as well. It seems to me that when we take a logic or critical thinking class, what we're doing is we're focusing on the method of philosophy in general, right, and turning our attention to that. And it has a different feel for sure than the rest of philosophy as a result, right, because it's more, I hesitate saying objective, but it's more objective than all the other aspects of philosophy, right? There's something more objective about it. And that gets established very early on in our textbook that we use, and in the lectures, we'll establish that very, very early on, right? There is this notion of what it means to be valid. Okay. Whereas, what is human nature really like? A question that other aspects of philosophy try to address. That's not as discernible. It's not as objective of a matter as whether or not this particular argument is valid or not. At least I would argue that. So and regardless, it has a very much a distinct, different feel than all the other aspects of philosophy. It is a different sort of animal, if you will. And so I say that, not to scare anyone or, it's not for better or worse. It is just so I guess what I would say, well, kind of, you don't take too much away in the sense of your opinions of this course ultimately. Don't think that all philosophy is like that. Now, how you approach these different elements of philosophy, though, right? You'll be hopefully using the tools we outline and flesh out in our particular course, right? But then how we proceed in these other courses, right? If you were to take ethics, for example, it's nothing like this course is, which again, it's almost like so objective. It has a more mathy feel. It's, we have exercises. At the end of my ethics lectures, I would always end with reflection questions. And then as their, typical assignment, they then have to, say post something if it's an online class, post a response to one of the respective questions. Well, in this course, right, you'll have exercises related to the concepts that were discussed. So it's more like a math homework, right, where you're going through these various exercises. So it has a totally different feel, for better or worse, right or wrong, right or wrong. It doesn't matter, I just wanted to point out that there is that definitely has a different feel. And so maybe conversely, maybe you had experience with another philosophy class and you didn't really like it. That doesn't mean you're necessarily not going to like logic. Okay. And there is definitely sort of, I've noticed over the years, how do I put it? Symmetry. That's not right. That's not the right word. If you are, you're in, lawyer, computer programming, what is the word I'm looking for? If you tend to have that kind of mindset, you'll probably find logic and critical thinking easier. I cannot figure out the word here I'm looking for, but a lot in common. Sort of in the way you have to, I guess, approach these different disciplines. It's always struck me as kind of similar. And in my experience, people who are successful in these various branches will also be successful in logic, or tend to be, and vice versa. And I should say that from the outset, that for what it's worth, so for foreign languages, for me, were always my weakness. It didn't matter. I tried a lot of different foreign languages. I spent at least 4 years learning Spanish, trying to back in high school. It didn't matter how long seemingly I studied it. Didn't matter which one it was. I always seem to struggle, learning foreign languages. And conversely, I have a buddy who's the opposite, and he's always suggested, and I've heard this is true, that the more with each new language you learn, the new ones, learning a new one becomes easier and easier. That never was the case for me. Maybe because I never learned the new one to begin with, the first one. But he was able to just learn a ton of different ones. But point here, though, is a lot of people have that experience with logic. For whatever reason, it can be very difficult for people who are otherwise very smart in other aspects of life, who seem to be very smart, very successful. You might find yourself, struggling for whatever reason, right? Maybe you wouldn't be a good lawyer, a good computer programmer, right? You just don't have, for whatever reason, that particular way of thinking or that mindset. Just like I don't have, it seems like, the mindset that is conducive to learning foreign languages for whatever reason. So I do want to throw that out there. In logic, there is that kind of element of logic as well. But having said that, if you find yourself struggling, and it doesn't seem like it's your easiest subject, you do struggle with it. There, having said all that, it is something that I think with practice, like learning an instrument, some of us are just better than others, but all of us, I think, if we put in the time and effort, can get better. And I think logic is like that. Our textbook provides tons of exercises, and I think it's one of those things where just more repetition and the better and better you're going to get. It really does come down to that with a lot of logic. You just gotta, especially the stuff we're going to get into in the second section of the course. So this first section is very intro-ish stuff. But the second section is going to get a lot more difficult, and it's really going to come down to you practicing, right? Doing those truth tables over and over and over. And if you put in the effort, go ahead and watch a video a second time. Hear me explain and elaborate the concepts a second time. If you put in the time, you practice, put in, the effort and so on, I do think that it is something that you can improve on. Okay. I don't know, maybe somebody would make the same point about foreign languages, but is that a good argument? I don't know. In my experience, right, that's been the case. So I don't. What I'm trying to say, the upshot of all this, is that I do recognize that this can be a tricky subject, as philosophy in general is. Okay, and I do all kinds of things to try to mitigate the difficulty of the course, of the subject as we proceed in the course. But I guess what I was getting at is, while that's the case, okay, no excuses, because it is something that I do believe if you put in the time and effort, you can get better at and you can be successful at. While it might be more difficult, it might require more time and effort for you to be successful at it. It is definitely possible, especially at this intro level. You think, by the way, right, when we get into that second section stuff, if you guys think that's tricky, it gets way more difficult, right? When you get into like symbolic logic and so on, the kind of stuff I had to do then when I got to the University of Kansas, it gets, a lot more complex. Okay, but I feel like I'm rambling a bit there on logic, but obviously we're going to get a much clearer picture of what logic is, logic and critical thinking, as we proceed throughout the rest of the course, and most notably, and then as we turn our attention to lecture 2, right, where I will get into, right, introduction to logic and critical thinking. We'll flesh out, actually there's a difference, right, and for our purposes, so, outside of this course, what we meant by the two would probably be pretty synonymous, right, but we're actually going to distinguish, a difference between logic and critical thinking, how it's related to philosophy in general. I've kind of already intimated how I think it's connected, and kind of the method in general of philosophy in general. We'll talk about, basically in our next lecture, we'll flesh out a lot of the general concepts. What is reasoning? What is truth? Or what kind of notion of truth are we going to work with? What's a claim, premise, conclusion? What's an argument? What's required? Very basic stuff then, the basic building blocks in some sense then that we will work with for the rest of the course. Okay? Particularly when we turn our attention to, section 2, for example, we'll turn our attention to arguments in particular. Well, we'll be building off of what we talk about then in this next lecture when we flesh out what an argument is and what two main elements are needed to have an argument. So I guess the point here is we'll be introducing a lot of general stuff then that you'll have to get a good handle on for what follows in the remainder of the course. Okay? So that's the game plan. Looking forward to lecture 2. Again, a lot of conceptual general stuff. And I guess that's really it as far as I have for introduction to the philosophy. For, again, lecture 2, we'll turn our attention to our particular subject, logic and critical thinking. We'll flesh out all the general concepts involved, the basic building blocks then that we'll be using for the rest of the course. So thanks for tuning into the first lecture, and I look forward to lecture 2. Thanks.